And soon what's going to happen is Ukraine will be in a position where their only role is to accept the dictation of unconditional surrender that will be imposed on them by a victorious Russia. The Russians have been consistent about demilitarization. Demilitarization means that all Western weaponry are removed and the Ukrainian military is shrunk to around 50,000 men. The Russians, I think in some of these conversations that I've monitored, they're talking about beginning the drawdown from a war-type economy in 2027. Even if the war ended today, they would continue for another 2 years because they have to produce this equipment to build to fully equip these new units that they're building from 900,000 to 1.5 million. Russia's done this despite the best efforts by the West to strangle them economically and prevent this. And while Russia has done this, they've grown their civilian economic sphere so that the people in Russia have good paydays. They have lots of stuff on the shelf. They're well fed, good standard of living. The Russians live in the real world. They don't live in the fantasy world. They don't live in a world where we wish everything was great and everything went the way we want it to go and all that. The Russians live in the hard, cold reality of life as it is. There was no pressure on Putin to stop the war. And I think the battlefield is evolving in a way that just is to the detriment of Ukraine on a daily basis. And the Russians are taking the current reality and improving it from the Russian perspective and putting the Ukrainians in a far worse position. So the longer this war goes on, the weaker Ukraine becomes. And the more apparent, the longer the United States avoid decisive engagement on behalf of Ukraine, the more difficult it becomes for Europe to pretend that they have the ability to step in and fill the gap. And maybe, just maybe, Ukraine will wake up to the reality that the best deal they have is the one that's on the table today. And that if they continue to wait much longer, as the Russians insinuated, we won't be talking about 4 oblasts that are part of Russia. We'll be talking about 8. And the other thing that people need to understand about Russia is that there's that old saying, slow to harness, fast to ride. The Russians aren't putting a lot of demands out there. Everything they've done, they've been compelled to do in a cause-effect relationship that has them reacting to actions taken by Ukraine and their Western supporters. Here, Russia is now getting ready to become proactive and moving forward to assert its demands and ensure that they're put out. The Ukrainians need to understand that the game is changing, that the day of Ukraine being able to have any say whatsoever at the negotiating table is rapidly coming to an end. And soon what's going to happen is Ukraine will be in a position where their only role is to accept the dictation of unconditional surrender that will be imposed on them by a victorious Russia. I think half the problem is that Donald Trump's team is decisively split on the issue of what peace with Russia would look like. Marco Rubio claims that he is the servant of the president, but when Marco Rubio's allowed off leash, he says things that are less than enthusiastic about the betterment of relations between the United States and Russia. Trump is the one guy whose strings you can't pull. And so I think what you're going to see now is that Trump is going to start engaging directly, decisively with Europe and Ukraine, especially Zelensky. I think you're going to see Trump putting a tremendous amount of pressure on Zelensky. And I think this might be part of the Russian goal, because here's Putin speaking positively about Trump, speaking about the need to respect the process, that the Russians are going to work on a draft treaty that details everything. And Zelensky's just saying no. And I think what Trump is going to do is going to identify the problem as Zelensky and then put pressure on Europe. And if Europe can't get Zelensky to change, to say, I'm done, walk away, but not walk away in a way that gives a green light to Besant to put sanctions on or allows Rubio to begin aid. Walk away saying Europe and Ukraine are on their own. Putin, talk to me when it's over, kind of thing. Because I do think that at the end of the day, Trump wants better relations with Russia. And if Trump recognizes that the impediment to peace isn't named Vladimir Putin, but rather Volodymyr Zelensky or Macron or Merz or any of these Europeans, then that brings clarity to this issue. Nothing that the conclusions that Vance drew are conclusions, speculative in nature. But the bottom line is Russia has engineered a very successful war economy. They have a defense industry now that is outpacing Europe and the United States combined. And that's a reality. And there are economic consequences to this in terms of workforce allocation, resource allocation. And when you get an overheated economy, it leads to higher inflation. Russia's going through all of these issues. And so what Vance's talk reflects is that he's spoken to an economist, maybe somebody in Treasury, maybe somebody in the CIA. It's getting a very simplistic economic overview. But you need to go deeper, because the key to this isn't what's on the surface, it's what's happening underneath. The meetings that Putin has with his economic team, with his national team, the state council, the meetings he has with various governors about economic development. And when you take that deep dive, and trust me, I take that deep dive every single week. So when you create a 70,000 strong new core-sized element in the newly formed St. Petersburg military district, where do the weapons come from? They come from the factories that have to produce these weapons. And once you produce weapons, understand this: the weapons you allocate for that core are the weapons that they begin conflict with. But the Russians now know that when you engage in high intensity conflict, you're going to be eating through equipment. So the Russians are building equipment to equip that core, plus replacement equipment that goes into depots throughout the country, staged. You need a fully functioning defense industry to do this in a timely fashion. And so Russia has a plan for this. And I think Vance is misreading that plan, not understanding that the Russians do have a plan to produce and then tone down. The Russians, I think, in some of these conversations that I've monitored, they're talking about beginning the drawdown from a war type economy in 2027. Even if the war ended today, they would continue for another 2 years, because they have to produce this equipment to build, to fully equip these new units that they're building from 900,000 to 1.5 million. And again, because they understand that once you engage in combat, you may not have time to get that defense industry up and running immediately. You've got to have replacement equipment on hand. So they're building the reserves. Russia's ready for whatever comes at it. And that's what their defense economy is doing. And the Russians have made a strategic decision to accept the consequences of this with a plan to mitigate and draw down. The Russians have been very honest with Steve Witkoff. Witkoff has come back and spoken about the Russian reality. When the Russians spoke to Rubio and Waltz before he was fired, they both came out and said there's a Russian reality, that we have to address the Russian reality. So the Russians have been very successful in communicating this, but the other players aren't up to the task of standing up to the pressure. Rubio goes to Europe and then bends to the will of Europe to start articulating things that indicate an exhaustion with this peace process. So yes, Europe wants Trump to be exhausted by this so that he then withdraws from it and then supports Europe's policies and supports Ukraine. They're trying to suck him into continuing Biden's policies. I think Putin is appreciative of the fact that Donald Trump has shown an ability to withstand that. But what's essential here is that Putin has to reaffirm in Trump's mind some essential truths that sometimes get watered down by Marco Rubio or Scott Bessent or Keith Kellogg and other people who don't have peaceful coexistence with Russia first and foremost on their mind. And they also need to put steel in the spine of people like J.D. Vance and Tulsi Gabbard and even Steve Witkoff, people who I think are on the right side but falter in the face of opposition. And one of the reasons why they falter is that Donald Trump himself is all over the map, saying this one day, saying that the other day. A conversation with Vladimir Putin, you are literally speaking to the source. And it helps strengthen Donald Trump. It empowers Donald Trump to say, I spoke with Putin for 2 hours. I know what Putin thinks, as opposed to relying on the interpretation from other people. I think this phone call was invaluable, and it creates the possibility. Because I think one of the things that's going to happen on this phone call is that Trump is going to wait a couple weeks. Keith Kellogg just has no desire to have good relations between the two nations, and yet he is still the special envoy to Ukraine. And Scott Bessent, all he wants to do is sanction Russia. Really, he wakes up every morning saying, how can I sanction Russia? Give me an excuse to sanction Russia. He's not looking for the betterment of relations. As the Secretary of Treasury, he should be looking for, you wake up every morning saying, how can we expand economic relations with Russia? That should be his goal. But Steve Witkoff has taken that space, because Witkoff seems to be the primary interlocutor between the United States, and Kirill Dmitriev, who is a Russian economist, is now heavily involved in this. This suggests, and based upon the conversation that Trump had with Putin, there's a heavy economic component to this dialogue that goes beyond the Ukraine conflict. But in short, all the economic potential that Trump, I believe, wants to put on the table, it can't happen until there's a resolution to this conflict. And Trump's problem is that he has a team that's decisively split. Even the people on his side are tentative, not fully committed, hesitant. And so this plays to Europe and Ukraine, who are able to cherry pick Trump's advisors to put pressure, and then they can weaken the resolve of those who, like J.D. Vance and Tulsi and Witkoff, who are supportive. Now they're like, oh, gosh, where's Trump? What are we going to do about NATO? Are we divorcing from NATO? Are we going to reinforce NATO, stand strong with NATO? I have to be careful what I say here. So they fall back on old talking points. And I just think the Europeans and Ukrainians have been playing America in the best way possible. They know which strings to pull because they've been pulling them for decades. Every time Putin leaves Moscow and travels around Russia, he's meeting with governors, he's meeting with economic leaders. And that's where you learn about what's going on in Russia. One of the whole ideas behind the 2020 constitutional embrace of the state council was that Putin is planning on pushing the governance of the Russian Federation out of exclusively Moscow down to the governors in the different oblasts or regions. That was the strategic vision behind that. I don't think Vance was told that, by the way. I don't even think he understands that. If I talk to him about the 2020 Constitution referendum in Russia and the role of the state council and other reforms that are made, he'd just look at me blankly. But it's the job of the CIA to put everything into perspective. But see, so these meetings, they have gravitas. They mean something. And so you listen to the conversations. First of all, by doing that, you understand that, yes, the military economy is very important. And yes, getting things up to speed. It's not just about Ukraine, though. Understand that because of the behavior of NATO and the United States, Russia made a strategic decision to expand its military from 900,000 to 1.5 million outside of the framework of the special military operation. There's a genius behind the Russian economy. This is why their economy still grows despite sanctions. This is why there's nothing the West could do to deter. The whole concept of sanctions was to ensure that Russia couldn't do what it's doing today, to have this economic potential turned into military industrial potential. Russia's done this despite the best efforts by the West to strangle them economically and prevent this. And while Russia has done this, they've grown their civilian economic sphere so that the people in Russia have good paydays. They have lots of stuff on the shelf. They're well fed. Good standard of living. I don't think J.D. Vance understands anything about Russia. That was a very superficial take. And I can't blame him. He's the vice president. He has his domestic responsibilities, but I blame the people who brief him because what he was saying is an absolutely incomplete and inaccurate vision of the reality of Russia's economic state. If you remember Ray McGovern, who I believe you know very well. Ray used to brief the president, but I think he was also the vice president. So he was the briefer of George H.W. Bush when he was the vice president. That's the same briefing. He gets the president's daily brief, the Fed. So Vance is being briefed. Now, Vance has the ability as any national level decision maker to ask follow-on questions. And since Vance probably has more time than the president, because he's backing him up as opposed to taking the lead, Vance might be able to ask more detailed questions and get more detailed follow-on briefings. I don't know. I'm not privy to that process. I'm just speculating here. So I just think that, it comes from the DNI, but like I said, J.D. Vance probably has the ability to ask for more detailed follow-on briefings that they can start bringing in subject matter experts, and then there should be some question and answer. But no intelligence manager likes to bring in the analyst. I'll tell you that from experience, because the intelligence manager wants to be the hero. The intelligence manager wants the person to be the person with the FaceTime. And the problem is, once you bring in the analyst to the principal, and the principal see who really is the brains of this operation, the principal keeps asking for the analyst, and the intelligence manager just pushed aside. So, that's the other half of the problem is there's just politics and the whole business of intelligence careerism as well. I have to be honest, if I were in the Trump administration, in my position on the Ukraine-Russian conflict, I would be advocating for as many Patriot batteries as possible for Ukraine because it's defensive in nature. Because my job is to preserve life. And if I make things too easy for Russia at the negotiating table, then there's no pressure on Russia to concede anything. This war shouldn't be easy for Russia to win. And while I would not be talking about HIMARS and ATACMS and systems that are offensive in nature, I would definitely be talking about Patriot missiles and probably be talking about 155 millimeter artillery shells as well. Again, those battlefield support systems that are needed to suppress Russian attacks. I would be doing everything I could to discourage continued Russian offensive operations against Ukraine. I would be trying to say that it's not in anybody's interest to continue this war. I don't think the Russians condemn Donald Trump for continuing to provide defensive weapons to the Ukrainians. I think they understand that's a reality. The Russians live in the real world. They don't live in the fantasy world. They don't live in a world where we wish everything was great and everything went the way we want it to go and all that. The Russians live in the hard, cold reality of life as it is. And this is why the Russians focus more on the fact that the president is willing to talk to them, that the president wants peace, than to get caught up in the minutia of U.S. weapons shipments and all that kind of stuff. They understand that the whole politics of weapons shipments and intelligence providing is tangled up in policies that overlap, that Trump inherited a whole bunch of baggage that's almost impossible to disentangle from. So the Russians are real, which is why they won't allow a ceasefire, because as much as Rubio talks about more, as Rubio said, we can't make them, and nobody wants to give them up. So even though Rubio wants to get more Patriots, they're not. And the Russians will continue their offensive in a Kiev that's increasingly defenseless, and the situation will get worse and worse for Ukraine. But I don't think we should get caught up in Marco Rubio asking for more Patriot missiles. That's common sense. It's not inconsistent with the policy vision of Trump. Trump is not asking Ukraine to roll over and play dead. Trump's asking both sides to stop fighting. Denazification. That means that the Zelensky regime is done, that the current Duma is done, that anything that has been touched politically by Banderist ideology or Ukrainian nationalism is done. And again, we have to reflect on the reality. Ukraine has undergone a dramatic demographic shift in the past couple years. Millions of Eastern Ukrainians who speak Russian have either taken Russian citizenship or fled Ukraine. What's left is a Ukraine that now is overrepresented by Western Ukrainians, by Lvov, by people who aren't Orthodox Christians. They're Greek Catholics, people whose historical legacy isn't in Moscow or Kiev or Rus, but in Galicia and Poland and Austro-Hungary. People who, as they developed a national identity, it was premised upon a deep hatred for all things. And this Western Ukrainian identity now is the dominant identity in Ukraine, and it's controlling everything. Nazification now means basically the termination of Ukraine as it's currently configured. Nobody in the West is talking about that as legitimate. And yet in Russia, there are plans for a denazi post-conflict Ukraine. How are those two? Stopping the fighting is the easiest part of this entire process. Even no NATO membership. I think everybody agrees that's an outcome. But in the EU thing, that's just, who cares? The bottom line is Ukraine will go where the victor tells it to go. And if Russia's the victor, that means Ukraine's orientation will be economically towards Russia, looking probably to be integrated into a union-type relationship similar to what Russia has with Belarus. This is why you can't ignore the fact that the head of the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, Rushkin, held a sort of a seminar earlier this year where they talked about Western Ukraine being given to the Poles, meaning that the best way to solve the problem of Western Ukrainian ultranationalism is to hand it off to the Poles and let them take care of it, knowing that the Poles have historical animosity towards Western Ukrainian nationalism as expressed by the ideology of Stepan Bandera. They remember the massacres of 1943, 1944, Berlin. But now we're talking about the dismemberment of Ukraine. And like I said, the key to understanding the slow pace of the special military operation lies not in a critical analysis of the Russian general staff, but of the state council, of the Duma, of the governors of the different economic bodies, because there's a whole bunch of economics tied into what's going on. And the economics is tied into diplomacy, the necessity of keeping open certain markets. It would become very difficult for Russia to keep Chinese and Indian markets open if it leveled Kiev, leveled Lvov, flattened Western Ukraine. And so Russia has to balance a whole bunch of things that normally a military person wouldn't be balancing. I mean, back in Iraq, just bomb Iraq into the Stone Age, and we did our damnedest to do. Yeah, we didn't seek to violate laws of war and commit war crimes, but we took out power plants, we took out bridges, we took out factories, we took out everything that we felt was a legitimate target. There's no advocate for the Palestinian people anywhere in the West. There's no pressure put on Israel. The numbers are staggering. I warned about this. I may even warned about it on the show. I said there's going to be an exhaustion. Hamas gave 15 months of solid resistance. They almost won it. They're that close. But in the end, war it's unpredictable. Nasrallah got killed. Hezbollah collapsed. Assad collapsed. Axis of resistance went down. A ceasefire was brought in, disingenuous in its negotiation and implementation, led to false expectations of peace. And I said at the time, if Israel breaks the ceasefire, because everybody's like, oh, Israel, the world will rally around I said, no, they won't. The world's done with Palestine. We grew accustomed to dead Palestinians, and now we have a ceasefire. And when Israel starts killing Palestinians again, it's not going to be a reemergence of the daily outrage, because we are already conditioned to accept a certain amount of death and destruction. So all the Israelis are going to do is bring us back up to the level that we already accepted. And this is what's happening. 137 civilians killed yesterday in a bombing attack. Where's the outrage? I know there's the activists out there, but where's the outrage where it counts? How's it moving the needle with the policymakers in Washington, D.C.? You're starting to see Europe come around. You're seeing Europe. I think today there was a letter from the French, the Belgians, and the Canadians condemning this. But when is the European Union can come out and stop selling weapons? France is talking about, but they haven't done it. Last time Macron made a mention of it, Netanyahu threatened to shut down. And the reason is there are no advocates for the Palestinian people that count. The people call themselves advocate, but who are you advocating to? If you're preaching to the choir, you ain't accomplishing a damn thing. You got to bring the sinners in, baby. You got to preach to the sinners. But at a minimum, he's getting what the president gets, and probably getting more based upon the questions and the fact that the president has handed off certain policy portfolio priorities to Vance, for Vance to be involved and engaged in. So Vance will want to become even better briefed on that. But there's the theory of CIA or DNI briefings, which is apolitical. We give them what's necessary. And then there's the reality. The briefer knows that if you come in with stuff that the briefee, that the customer doesn't want, their eyes roll and they shut it down, and you lost connectivity. So you bring in things that will catch their attention, that are designed to be readily absorbed, to make yourself even more relevant. And what happens is you often sacrifice accuracy for the reasonable goal of maintaining connectivity. You want the vice president or the president to look forward to the briefing. You want them to be receptive to the briefing. In order to do that, you've got to play a little game in terms of making the product digestible. You're inviting the president to a restaurant, the food better taste good. If you invite him to a restaurant and you put bad tasting food in front of him, the president can be looking for people who are going to start sugarcoating things. So there's a little bit of sugarcoating going on in all the intelligence that's given to people. Plus, they're still trying to figure out this president. Where does he stand on issues? Because he literally is all over the board sometimes on certain things. Israel and Gaza. One day, Israel can do whatever they want. The next day, they need to stop. It's bad. Well, now you're the briefer going, what am I supposed to brief? So it doesn't mean that I want Russians dead, but it also means that I'm not going to sit back and make it easier for Russia to kill Ukrainians. We have a moral responsibility. We started this war. And it's our job now to bring this war to an end. But you don't do that by making Ukraine defenseless at all. And no, it should be a top priority of the United States to continue to enable Ukraine to defend its airspace and to enable Ukrainian units to defend themselves if they come under attack. That's just the way it is. To be honest, I can't speak for the Russians, But I would be surprised if any Russian sat there and was like, well, that's just ridiculous. I think all the Russians would go, yeah, that makes sense. But that's why we have a strategy to overcome their air defenses. And that's why we have new tactics and weapons on the battlefield to overcome that. And we will continue the attack. Okay. But at least the Russians have acknowledged now that they've had to do things, and those things come at a cost. And if the Russians make the decision to continue offensive operations, they'll pay a higher price. And that's a result of a decision made by the Russians, not a result of the Ukrainians attacking the Russians, but a decision by the Russians to continue offensive operations. And then as an American, my job would be to tell the Russians, do you really want to continue paying this cost? Why can't we find a way to bring this thing to an end? But Trump, I don't think at this juncture, as long as Ukraine shows a willingness to consider the possibility of peace, Trump will continue to provide the ability to Ukraine to defend itself. If Ukraine shows that they have no desire for peace, that what they want to do is continue offensive operations, Trump, I think at that time will say, that's not what we're going to do. We're walking away. But I do agree with you that Rubio and Kellogg and others seem to be articulating very strongly from the perspective of the Ukrainians as opposed to the perspective of Trump. I think they confuse the fact that Trump is willing to consider continued assistance to Ukraine from a defensive perspective. I think they misconstrue that into Trump wants to continue to support Ukraine in general. And I don't think Trump wants to continue to support Ukraine in general. I think Trump wants Ukraine to bring an end to this war. This is why I'm not confident that there's going to be a peace agreement, because the reality of what Russia's demanding and what Ukraine is insisting on, we're completely different worlds. The Russians have been consistent about demilitarization. Demilitarization means that all Western weaponry are removed and the Ukrainian military is shrunk to around 50,000 men. Demilitarization means that Ukraine will never again be allowed to be used by the West as a proxy force to launch offensive attacks against Russia. Nobody in the West supports this. Nobody in the West supports this. And yet, there it is. Except the Belarus-Russian relationship was based upon some notions of equality and respect. Putin respects Lukashenko. The Ukrainian-Russian relationship will at least start as a subordinate relationship on the part of Ukraine towards a dominant Russia. It may improve over time, but that's the reality. You don't get to that through negotiations. You can't get to that through negotiations. That can only happen when Russia crushes Ukraine and Ukraine has no other choice but to accept terms of surrender. But again, these terms are going to be very difficult. A lot of people aren't talking about the reality of Lvov in Western Ukraine, because Nazification would require Russia occupation and Russian dominance of those regions. And that's a completely different picture than what Putin's talking about right now. Even when the Russian negotiators stood up to the Ukrainians and said, when we come back, we'll be talking 8, not 4. He's talking Odessa, Mykolaiv, Dnipropetrovsk, the rest of Little Russia. Maybe they'll bring in a 9th one, Sumy, that the Russians are going to take to secure Kursk and Belgorod. But no Russians right now talking about going into Western Ukraine, into Lvov and Ivano-Frankivsk and all these other areas. No. But denazification would require Russian political and social control over those regions. As we're speaking to dismemberment, understand what's going on with Hungary right now. There's moves afoot. The Hungarians are making moves to protect the Hungarian population in Carpathia. That could lead to annexation. And if you start knocking that off, the Romanians may come in and start securing areas that belong to them as well. We could be looking at the dismemberment of Ukraine. Nobody's talking about that today. But that's a realistic outcome. So these negotiations right now, I think right now there's a bunch of theater, a bunch of posturing, because they're not addressing, as what the Russians call, the root cause of this conflict. And once the Russians start to get very specific about the root cause as they see it, nobody in the West is going to be satisfied with the prescriptions that Russia is writing. Part of the problem here is that the Western Ukrainians have some very high-profile advocates advocating for their position to the United States, Europe, NATO, even many Americans, Lindsey Graham and others. And so it also in some ways serves as a deterrent to Russia. You don't want to give these political forces more ammunition to mobilize against Russia. So you temper. Oh, yeah, I have to tell you, I can't speak for the Russian general staff. I don't know I can't, they know what their goals and objectives are and the pace of operations, et cetera. But having planned or helped plan and implement a strategic air campaign, I was just a captain, so I'm not one of the colonels up there making the big decisions, but I was an observer. I'm a pretty damn good observer. So I observed the totality of the thought process that went into the creation of the strategic air campaign against Iraq. And then I was there intimately following it being executed. I know what it takes to break a nation. And Russia's not trying to break Ukraine. It's a very frustrating thing as a military analyst because my analytical models are predicated upon purely militaristic approaches. Russia has a whole bunch of politics woven into there. And it's Russian unique politics, meaning that it's difficult for a Westerner to understand them at first blush. Only if you actually talk to the Russians, study the Russians, get into that, whatever magic connectivity Israel has with France, and Macron immediately backed off. Nobody's shown the courage to step up to the Israelis. Why they commit genocide openly in our face. Yes, we have people here. Ray McGovern, again, I talked to him yesterday. He is very emotional when it comes to Gaza. But Ray knows I feel this way, and I'll just say it. It's not a bad thing on Ray, but nobody in the Trump administration cares how emotional Ray McGovern gets, or how Code Pink gets, or how any pro-Palestinian group gets. They have no connectivity with the government, which is one of their fatal mistakes, is that they've spent so much time protesting the government that they have no ability to put pressure on the government. And this is why I recommended yesterday that maybe Ray and others look at creating a forum of connectivity to engage in constructive dialogue, looking for solutions, not just identifying transgressions. It's very easy and morally correct, by the way, to stand up and condemn the Gaza genocide, but not a damn thing's happening from it. You're not changing policy. You're not affecting policy. And continued demonstrations will only further entrench both sides. Some effort's going to have to be made to get that connectivity in there. You have to hold your nose on some things, but it's more important to talk constructively than it is to shout at each other across barricades at this juncture, because I have to ask, how are you helping the Palestinian people, the people of Gaza, by continuing protests? Your protests are getting nowhere, not in the United States. But here's another question. Who are your potential allies in the Trump administration? And what effort have you made to reach out to them to begin a dialogue so that when a question is asked, you're there with the answer? You can say, hey, and they trust you. I got really slammed hard for engaging in a dialogue with Alan Dershowitz. I was slammed all over the place. People were just, you shouldn't talk to him and all that. I won't say the word, but it begins with an F and it sounds suck. You, anybody who's against that, because Alan Dershowitz does have the ear of the administration and the ear of people. Imagine if you could actually sit down and have a constructive dialogue with Alan Dershowitz and cut through the emotions, the attacks. And maybe you can't solve everything, because you can't solve everything, but find one or two things that you agree upon and then begin a dialogue on that so you get connectivity, so that maybe when that problem comes up, Alan Dershowitz says, Scott Ritter had a good idea. Hey, Scott, why don't you come in and sit down and talk to the people about this idea? And now you have a conversation, and then, bam, one little aspect of life in Gaza gets better because of that. And then you build upon that success. And who knows where it will go. But today, there's no connectivity. We talk about Western Ukraine and the dichotomy, the differences between how the West treats the Western Ukraine, how Russia treats Western Ukraine, and how the West treats the people of Gaza and how Israel treats them. And the sinners right now is the Trump administration, everybody in Congress who facilitates the genocide. And if you're not talking to them, if you're not having a constructive dialogue with them, if you don't even have the ability to interact with them, you're not accomplishing a damn thing. All you're doing is shouting to yourself. You might as well piss in the wind and call it rain, because that's all that's happening.